forgot to do that. All right, well, thanks for having me again. And as Josh already mentioned, this one's called Postmodernism is the Opiate to the Masses. It was Karl Marx who said that religion is the opiate to the masses. And he could have included in that statement law and morality, as those three things, Marx believed, made up bourgeois man's false consciousness, or the power structure that was built up by the powerful classes for the purpose of pacifying the lower classes. And the idea is simple. You give them a story and a narrative that would satisfy them in their current status, make them docile and satisfied to be doing nothing of importance. And that's the idea. And I'm going to be claiming that postmodernism is actually the thing that does that in the modern world. We're going to see three different things. It's really simple this time because really we're just going to ask the questions, where did this come from? What is it saying? And where's it going? So very short, sweet outline, but my talk might not be short and sweet, especially the first section, because I think it's important to go through the question of where did this come from, the philosophical roots, the historical roots. Here's the main thesis. So if you get lost, just come back to this, because this is what I'm claiming here. And this is what I mean by postmodernism is the opiate to the masses. I'm claiming that whether it's intentional or unintentional, postmodernism is philosophical anarchy, replacing one totalizing system with another. So if you know how political anarchy does that, that it's not really run by a bunch of people who don't believe in any kind of order or any kind of violence, but it's usually run by people that have guns in their hands, and that when the new order comes in, it's those that are armed that do that. So it's a bunch of people that believe in order, and they believe in replacing the current order with a new order, and they're not honest about that. And so that's what we're going to see about this, philosophical anarchy. Anybody who's seen the recent movie version of Tolkien's The Hobbit might recall that table conversation at the elven city of Rivendell between the wizards. You remember that, when they were sitting at the table and that Saruman was going on and on rambling about there's no more evil people in the world, there's no evil, we've taken care of that. That sort of thing's gone away. And I felt like I was hearing some kind of a 19th century liberal theologian. And do you remember the, I can't remember her name, the blonde elf, wizard, yeah, whatever her name is. You remember what she said? She sort of communicated telepathically to Gandalf, and she said, "You know, don't you?" And what was she asking? What was the question? You know that Saruman has turned. You know what all this nonsense means. And sometimes it takes even a wizard time to tell whether or not someone spouting such nonsense is deliberately eroding the foundations of the old order dishonestly, or if he really believes all of that drivel about moral neutrality and intellectual impotence. Philosophical anarchy, whether it's intended or not, has a tendency. Philosophical anarchy, whether you're a wizard or if you don't read any of these things, has an actual nature and an actual consequence. So where did all this come from, this thing called postmodernism? Well, to answer that question, we have to go back to the guy that I really think is the seminal thinker in all of this, and that is the 18th century Prussian philosopher Immanuel Kant. You have to go back all the way to the giants of modern philosophy who were already working on the modern corpse. Kant is really the ultimate thinker here. And when he publishes the Critique of Pure Reason in 1781, that bombshell in philosophy determines everything else after that. Whether you've read him or not, you think like him. Because everybody that taught you anything thinks like him. Because the thinkers of Western civilization bought it, hook, line, and sinker. Kant, as a young man, was troubled by the skeptical conclusions of David Hume. And Hume's conclusions can be summarized by the last line of a book he wrote in 1748 called Inquiry Concerning Human Understanding. And Hume ended that book with essentially a challenge. He said this: if we take in our hand any volume of divinity or school metaphysics, in other words, anything from those scholastics back in the Middle Ages, for instance, let us ask, in other words, when we're reading any of their sentences, let us ask, does it contain any abstract reasoning concerning quantity or number? No. Does it contain any experimental reasoning concerning matter of fact and existence? No. Commit it then to the flames, for it can contain nothing but sophistry and illusion. Now, in the 20th century, people actually took the time to look back at that sentence and say, wait a minute, that sentence is neither purely mathematical or purely empirical. And by Hume's standard falls. It's a violation of the law of non-contradiction. But at the time in the 18th century, there was no Christian thinker around who was able to carefully construct or deconstruct that sentence. Well, Immanuel Kant grew up in a Lutheran pietistic home in Germany, where his particular theological tradition did not emphasize deep thinking. And so he was very troubled by this. Kant understood, as he read things like this, that the original dream of the Enlightenment had to be rescued from this conclusion. See, it wasn't just Christianity that David Hume was attacking. Hume unwittingly actually pulled the rug that he was standing on out from under him. If what Hume was saying is true, then no sentence about anything can make any logical sense. And so Kant was very concerned about this. The old schools in the Enlightenment, rationalism and empiricism, were two methods for how to start your philosophy. The method for how to do philosophy. Where do you start? And what Kant was realizing, what Hume had already proven, was that both of these schools, rationalism and empiricism, both rested on something that themselves couldn't be proven. And you had to go back to some prior assumption. And so Kant's own major work, The Critique of Pure Reason, would divide reality up between an upper story and a lower story. And here's what he did that was so foundational to everything else. Everywhere else we move after Kant, follow that line. Because that line was bought. That was my only mistake. I think Kant was born in 1724. I was throwing this together really fast today. I'm pretty sure that's my only mistake. 1724 was when he was born. But at any rate, what he did is he divided reality up by two tiers. And at first glance, it kind of looks like the same two stories to the house of all of Western philosophy before him, going all the way back to Plato. Above the line, you had the real essence of things. Things as they are. Not things as they appear down here in the world of motion, but things as they actually are. So you have up there things like God, the self. The thing in itself is a weird phrase, but if you understand what Kant means by the thing in itself, you'll understand everything else. He just means the essence of anything, the way it is. Things like love and logic and immortality and the moral law and all those things that you can't see but which you need in order to talk intelligibly about the things you can see. And so he called that realm in the upper story the noumenal, from the Greek word noumen, noumenal. And then on the bottom floor, the lower story, you have the world of appearances, things down here. And he called that the phenomenal. But the difference between what Kant meant by that and what everybody from Plato to Kant meant by that made all the difference in the world. Above that line were objects as they are. A equals A. A thing is what it is and not something else. That is the fundamental law of logic, the law of identity. But to get above that line, you needed something called pure reason. You needed abstract reason. And that's what the dream of Western philosophy always was. And so he said, pure reason can't go there. But below that line, we still have to live. And Kant's major concern was not a personal relationship with Jesus. Though he did come from, I don't know, personal, the state of his soul or what he really believed about Christianity. But his major concern was science and ethics. There was two things that Enlightenment man still needed to do. He needed to know his world and manipulate it technologically, and he needed to not kill each other in the process. And so you still needed science and you needed ethics. So you can't prove that God exists. You can't prove that the laws of logic exist in order to argue for them and in order to argue against them. You have to assume them in your sentence. So he said, I can't prove that, but I have to assume that God exists, or I have to assume that a moral law exists, or else it's ethical anarchy down here. Or else we can't even do science. And so I have to assume by practical reason, not pure reason, practical reason, I have to presuppose certain fundamental conditions in order to do science and ethics. No longer can anybody speak to another self some proof of any object in itself. No longer was there anything that stood above me and you that I could speak to you about as an object that commands both of our attention. And so, if you've guessed it by now, with Kant, you really have the advent of modern agnosticism. Not simply agnosticism about God, but if you're consistent, it has to be agnosticism about science and ethics as well. And Kant understood that, but he thought it was worth the risk. Now, there's two basic kinds of reactions to Immanuel Kant on the continent. So you have continental philosophy, and that's typically German and French philosophy that was reacting directly to Kant. The first possible reaction was an attempt to save reason, to rescue objective reason from this death blow. And that task belonged to Georg Wilhelm Friedrich Hegel. And Hegel's dates are 1770 to 1831. And what Hegel did is he essentially took Kant's line. Remember, Kant's line is going to determine everything else after that. He takes Kant's line and he does this. He goes, he turns it that way toward 2 o'clock, and it's pointing that. Let me explain to you what I mean by that. In Hegel's mind, every generation, every school of thought had a thesis, a worldview, a basic set of assumptions. And let's just call it A. That's their thesis. And the next generation, or some opposing school, would come along, and they would say non-A. They would contradict it. And so traditional Western logic would look at that and say, well, that's just truth and falsity, A and non-A. But what Hegel was saying is that you had one generation that had a thesis and another generation that had an antithesis. But if you believe what Kant was saying, you can't judge between those views. So what happens is another generation comes along, a third generation, and it chews the meat and it spits out the bones, so to speak, of the original thesis and the original antithesis, and it takes the best of both. And it forms what he called a synthesis. And so reason, maybe we can't reach it, like Kant was saying, right now or in the past. It's not an eternally abiding thing. Maybe reason is not either or. Maybe it's both and. And if you know anything about comparative religion, you know this is more like what Eastern man has always thought like, not like Western man. Now, because the synthesis becomes a new thesis, it too has an antithesis. So I don't have it on the board, but just imagine that synthesis becomes a new thesis, that then has an antithesis, and then that arrow does what? It goes in the same direction. What's happening? A rational evolution, long before Darwin came along and gave it a biological scheme. So Hegel, much like Western man, was already believing in this thing that came to be known as progressivism. And this came to be known after Hegel's generation as a new dialectic. They didn't use that word the way Plato and traditional Western philosophy did. The dialectic painted a picture of how human reason can be real after all, but it's off in the future. And so for Hegel, there was a logic, capital L. There was a truth, or what he called the absolute, or spirit, Geist in the German. It was kind of like an eschatology. And if you ask Hegel, well, how do you know what the standard for something true and false is here if it's somewhere off in the future? Nobody's ever been there. That would have been a good question. But that's how he tried to rescue reason. Here's another aspect of Hegel's thought. Because this reason was absolutizing over everybody, it was also collective. And so there's what Hegel started to call the zeitgeist, or the spirit of the age. And this directs everybody in the culture, seizes everybody in a particular culture, and their thoughts toward that definite end. And of course, the most highly rational evolved kind of that zeitgeist was the German, as it always is, the most superior rational form, and you start to see the seeds of anti-Semitism in the 19th century. Well, there was another way of reacting to Kant, and that took his inner point, which is going to be the more important point for us, a little bit more seriously, and that was another philosopher named Arthur Schopenhauer. And Schopenhauer's dates are 1788 to 1860. And he probably took Kant's epistemology more seriously. He was focusing on the individual will that's motivated by our own ends. Now, Schopenhauer's a weird guy. He's a pessimist, and his concentration is that the will is always moved by our own selfish desires, and those desires are always evil. And those evil desires are what lead to suffering. And so the answer to the end of suffering is the end of desire. And so he was attracted to Eastern religion. So one of the ironies here is that these Germans are creating a philosophy that they think to be superior to everyone else, and yet it draws them away from Western thought toward Eastern thought. But the title to his basic work really speaks for itself, and that's what's going to show us how you get to this next step toward postmodernism. It was a book called The World as Will and Representation. So here's the important part, not the suffering stuff. The important part is that you're like a camera. And you might say, well, the camera doesn't lie, but the cameraman can point it to whichever way he wills. And so you watch the network news and you think, well, the camera doesn't lie. But yeah, but there's a cameraman. And you know that where he decides to point the camera is what is newsworthy. And so you have bias there. And Schopenhauer, for him, he's saying this is inevitable. Remember what Kant said. We can't speak about a reality that's up here anymore, that's objective, that's binding over all of us. Now the world is represented in my will. My will creates the field of representation in the world. The only objects worth talking about, the only thing that is the world, is my representation. And so this is where everything's going after Kant, and it shapes every other subject in academia. This new subjective object of thought. The only objects of thought are subjective. Now, it took the British and the Americans a little bit longer to catch on to this and to try to be as cool as the German and the French. So they still dawdled along in the 19th century and still talked scientifically about things as if you could still talk about them. But they caught on. Friedrich Nietzsche's the next interesting thinker. And there's a lot of interesting things about him that we're not going to get a chance to talk about, but for our purposes here, he just takes the next step. He just looks back at these guys and says, why even talk about any of these objects at all? Why even talk about objective as if that could ever be anything other than natural phenomena? Nature is all there is. Now, the existentialists are going to see what Nietzsche does with this, because Nietzsche was brutally honest. For everything else that's bad about Nietzsche, Nietzsche was brutally honest and prophetic about where naturalism was going to lead. If nature's all there is, then we've killed God. And if we kill God, then we've killed man. And Nietzsche pretty much predicted that the 20th century would be the bloodiest century in the history of humanity. And he was absolutely right. He just didn't have a problem with it. Because for him, the thing that was killing Western man, killing civilization, was Christianity and Judaism, because they talked about this morality that's binding on everybody, and then Christians came along and preached the death of your own will. He misunderstood what Christians were preaching, but he called Christians preachers of death. And what really needs to happen if we want to save civilization is we need to reassert the will to power. And so you have that idea of the Superman, which was so influential on Adolf Hitler and the Third Reich. But in his book, Beyond Good and Evil, which a lot of people are Nietzsche apologists, and they say, well, he was never anti-Semitic, and they obviously don't understand the essence of what Hebrew thought was, because Nietzsche hated nothing more than the objective morality that Moses gave to the Israelites. But in his mind, why are we talking about any of this stuff at all? The only thing that is real, the only thing that is properly an object, are phenomena. But he at least understood what Kant was talking about. I mean, take any object like a piece of chalk or anything else. Kant's attack was not simply on God and the self and the laws of logic, things you can't see. Physical things that you can see are always breaking down. And so Kant, at least at this point, is thinking very sophisticated on that level. And so Nietzsche's looking at that. He's admitting it and saying, why is such belief necessary, he says in this book. He says, in effect, it is high time that we should understand that such judgments must be believed to be true for the sake of the preservation of creatures like ourselves, though they still might naturally be false. Nietzsche admitted that you need these invisible objects to be speaking sensibly about natural objects. But he said, since we know that's not true, we have to assume that they're true. Nonsense. Now, Nietzsche, as I said, is most famous for bringing naturalism to its logically ugly conclusions, which were unacceptable to a new school called the existentialists. And in one sense, existentialism begins in Soren Kierkegaard in the 19th century, but for our purposes here, talking about postmodernism, it really begins in a school that a lot of people have really never heard of called phenomenology. Edmund Husserl is that philosopher, and his dates are 1859 to 1938. He was really the leading proponent of this school called phenomena, and all of the existentialists that are famous learned from him, were friends with him, and learned from him. In Husserl's mind, and he picks up right where Schopenhauer left off, consciousness is always intentional. Logical categories, thinking about objects like the cameraman, deciding what's newsworthy, is always intentional. So phenomenology has two steps to it. You know these two steps, so you can understand the whole thing. The first looks into the consciousness, the subject. And the second redefines the objects of that inner phenomenon, things as they appear to me in my mind, redefines that as the new ontology, the new being. The only thing I have to look at are things as they appear to me, things as they are in my perspective. This affects psychology. You ever hear of Carl Rogers, Rogerian psychology? Reality is perception. Where did he get that from? Husserl, who got it from Schopenhauer, who got it from Kant. Kant affects everything else that comes after him. Well, the existentialists pick up on this idea and coin a maxim of their own that really explains the word existentialism. And it's this maxim that existence precedes essence. That's my funny picture of the night right there. I thought that was the best picture of Sartre I could find, so I went with it. But existentialism can be defined as existence preceding essence. And this really explains everything from their epistemology, which nobody really cares about, but which we're going to care about tonight, to the drug use in the campuses of the 1960s. This quest to authenticate yourself, which comes to mean to write your own self into existence, because you are, as Heidegger said, thrown into the world. You're already in a world. You're already in a story that's bigger than yourself, and your existence precedes your essence. In fact, it's kind of imperialistic for anybody to impose an essence on you. You have to self-authenticate. Well, Heidegger wrote his most famous book, Being and Time, in 1927. A lot of people think that was the most influential philosophical book of the 20th century. And Sartre wrote his famous book, Being and Nothingness, in 1943. These are massive books, not the kind of books that the hippies are reading while they're doing drugs, pretending to read Sartre. They're not reading these. They're reading his plays and probably not really even understanding those. But it makes you popular, and it justifies drug use as an act of authenticating yourself, regardless of what you wind up with. Whether you're a saint or whether you run over an old lady in the street, at least you're authenticating yourself. And that was the idea. Now, Sartre was more pessimistic than Heidegger. And he was arguing that you never really get to fulfill this quest to arrive at your being, to arrive at your essence. But what's going to be important for us is where this era of anti-philosophies landed us. Because when it comes to objective meaning, by the time you get to, let's just say, 1950, when it comes to objective meaning of things in general and of words and texts in particular, the leading philosophical schools were anti-philosophies. Francis Schaeffer called them anti-philosophies because they were absurd, and they were intentionally absurd. But they had bought this for so long that they couldn't even see the nonsense they were saying. Even the Anglo-American schools that were so, no, we're going to hold out and we're going to keep talking about sense data as if it's the real thing. And you see that in 19th century English and American thought. But even a guy like Ludwig Wittgenstein, who many regard to be the most genius philosopher of that era, he starts out as a disciple, basically, of Bertrand Russell and those guys, and he starts out being a good empiricist. He's part of the analytical school in philosophy. But he retires. He gets sick of this because he's too busy being a genius, and he's thinking. And there's actually a story that after he came to this conclusion that nothing has any meaning, there's a story that while he's on his philosophical sabbatical, he retired from it, he's on this train in Italy, I think it is, and somebody gives him the Italian salute, which is the middle finger, and he realizes, well, that's got to mean something. And so that spurred this spawned this new philosophical inquiry for him. And he comes up with this idea that really starts to put him over to the postmodern side. And when postmodern people talk about the roots of their ideas, they have to reach back into something like this. And you can't read anybody on hermeneutics today, in other words, on interpreting texts, that doesn't draw back and talk about this idea of a language game. So, what on earth is a language game? Well, it's basically a closed system of meaning. It's a circle. So stop right here. So remember I said Kant defines everything else after. Follow that line. Hegel just did this with it. Schopenhauer opened it up and said that's what we're talking about, the inner self and so on. The existentialist said that's what has to authenticate itself. Wittgenstein just takes that, just like an old coat hanger, and goes, and he makes it into a circle. So what's a language game? Well, it can be as big as a whole culture. It can be a subculture. It could be a world culture. It could be an individual mind. And the idea is that these symbols and these meanings, they really are objective in that circle. They really do have meaning in that circle. But they have no objective meaning that binds your conscience outside of that circle. And he actually made the statement, if there is going to be any meaning that stands over everybody in this world, over all cultures, there has to be what he called a transcendent speaker. It would have to be a book of all books. And that's exactly what the Christian worldview is talking about. It's just interesting that he said it like that. But that's what a language game is. It's this closed system of meaning. And unfortunately, people in the church talk like this today about Christian doctrine. All these people are getting this from Wittgenstein, who got this from the existentialists and phenomenologists, who got this from Schopenhauer, who got this from Kant. Kant determines everything after Kant, unless you go back to Kant and show why he was wrong, which nobody in philosophy is willing to do. And all of that brings us to postmodernism proper. And I ran out of time to get more pictures, so I just matrix. Yeah. Because the matrix is the foremost authority on postmodern thought in the last dozen years or so. So that's why I went with that. But all the thinkers after 1960 in the postmodern school are pretty much just dividing themselves into different areas of thought, mostly focusing on texts. And then you got a guy like Foucault, the French guy, who talks about power. So if you ever hear the expression that words of power, no, knowledge is power, well, he just flipped that on its side and said, well, actually, power determines knowledge. And so a lot of them are just being a bunch of Marxists. They're really doing what Marxists had already done, the cultural Marxists. They're deconstructing everything. They're deconstructing texts. They're deconstructing everything. So you got this one guy, Hans-Georg Gadamer, whose dates are 1900 to 2002. He wrote a book called Truth and Method. And he argued against classical hermeneutics. And if you think, well, that doesn't matter. I don't care about poetry. I don't care about literature. Do you care about constitutional law? Do you know what the debate is in constitutional law behind all the other debates? It's a debate between what's called originalists and progressivists, or strict constructivists and judicial activists. In other words, the question, the debate is, does the meaning of the author of that law take precedent over the supposed progressive wisdom of the people or 9 judges deciding for everybody else? That's a hermeneutical question. That's an objective meaning question. That question is rooted back in this question. Classical hermeneutics sought an original meaning of a text. What did the speaker or the writer mean to say? The method for seeking this meaning followed from the assumption that the speaker has an interpretive priority over the interpreter. Seems like a nice, good thing to do. It's your personal intellectual property. In fact, isn't it not nice when you're speaking to somebody to always assume what they mean and not allow them to say, no, I didn't mean that. Let me say that differently. Isn't that rude when you're talking to somebody right there? Well, why would it be any different when you're reading somebody in a book? But Gadamer started to say that no such priority exists, because no such meaning exists apart from the interpretive process. In fact, the school which he helped imagine has become postmodernism's answer to modern philosophy's project of epistemology. It's how we know anything inside the texts. Well, some more philosophers are important. You have this other guy, Jean-Francois Lyotard, who wrote a book in 1979 called The Postmodern Condition, and he's the guy that really came up with that expression, meta-narrative. Well, postmodernists started to say there's no such thing as a meta-narrative. And while we're at it, there's no such thing as a universal. What's a universal? Well, that's something that goes all the way back to Plato and Aristotle, and it's something that is something like truth or justice or beauty. In other words, it's an eternally
abiding, existing, unchanging thing. They were claiming that it's a real thing. If it's not, if it's just a useful name we slap on something like an adjective and that's all there is to it, well, then our words don't really have any objective meaning when we say, good job, good boy. That was a just act, that was an unjust act. Those words are as meaningful as a belch or a fart, unless justice, truth, beauty, goodness are things which are unchanging. Well, these guys said, no. There is no meaning, no story, no explanation, no rule that's adequate to explain everything. And so they talked about a hermeneutics of humility. We don't know enough to know whether or not this thing says anything. Do you know that? And so it becomes the same kind of downward spiral as in Kant. This whole philosophy of postmodernism applies itself to everything in life, even though that's contradicting the idea that there's no such thing as a meta-narrative. It becomes a meta-narrative. Postmodernism applied to politics is called post-colonialism, since traditional Western political theory, like all authoritative speech, is an act of colonial aggression. Postmodernism applied to the conservative American church is called post-evangelicalism, since the objective gospel was also an attempt to imperialistically set one cultural set of truth claims over another. Postmodernism applied to architecture is called post-constructivism. You say, what on earth can that possibly mean? Well, one time Christian apologist Ravi Zacharias tells the story of when he was given a tour of a work of postmodern architecture. He was taken around to see the stairs that led to nowhere, the ceilings and the walls. Everything was intentionally unintentional. Nothing served a coherent structural purpose. And finally, Zacharias got annoyed at all this and said, tell me something, have you done the same thing with the foundations? And that's exactly what postmodernism claims to have done. To get us beyond foundations. So what is postmodernism really saying? That was the longest section because it has to be the longest section. We have to see how we got here. So slightly more concise, what is postmodernism saying? If that's where it has come from, what is it in its final crystallized form, even though it doesn't believe in final crystallized forms? And then if you say, well, fine, you don't believe in a final crystallized form, what's going to be postmodern? Okay, so you got to choose your poison there. But what is it saying? Well, the first thing that postmodernism is saying is really more of an observation. And it's an observation we can kind of agree with. The first thing is not really unique to postmodernism at all. It's an observation which I think all Christians can agree with. And that is that the modern project called the Enlightenment or modernism or the secular new world and all that good stuff has utterly failed in the realms of academics and politics. But here's the problem with saying that. And it should be obvious. And I think this is where a lot of postmoderns and a lot of Christians, unfortunately, have been somewhat naive in this observation. And that is just because the emperor has been exposed with no clothes doesn't mean that that emperor is not still the emperor. And that he can't throw that nasty little child who had the nerve to point it out into an internment camp. You know the story, that little boy that said, hey, but Mom, he doesn't have any clothes on. He's still the emperor. He won a PR war. The fact that he didn't win a war on real ideas matters little. He won the PR war. However many dead bodies we count up at the bloody hands of the secular state, however many failed predictions we point out to the 19th century European fairy tales of Hegel, Marx, Darwin, and Freud, it matters little. The damage has been done. John Dewey, another philosopher, his educational program was implemented during the era of the world wars. And what one sociologist called the vertical invasion of the barbarians has taken its toll. In other words, there simply wasn't enough people, teachers, qualified in classical thinking to soak up the new demand of people. You remember, there's universal education now, the GI Bill after World War II. Good stuff, but there wasn't enough classically trained teachers to soak up the demand of the new culture. There are not enough people around who understand classical logic and language and history sufficiently to put these imposters in their place. So this observation that modernity has failed, while interesting, while I agree with it, is going to have to make a better case than postmodernism can make. For example, what does postmodernism blame for this failure of the Enlightenment? I would summarize it in 2 points, and now you're going to see what postmodernism is uniquely saying, that the Christian worldview is not saying. We have a criticism of the modern worldview as well. But notice how different the postmodern criticism is. Notice also, by the way, when I get into this, how postmodernism, in criticizing modernism, is going to flatly contradict the entire Christian worldview as well. How it's going to be blaming the modern worldview for things that the modern worldview actually inherited from the Christian worldview and which modernity perverted. But if you don't know that, you're going to read those critiques of modernism and not realize that they are fundamentally a criticism of the historic Christian worldview. So here's how I would summarize it in 2 points. The first criticism of postmodernism of modernity has to do with the old roots and the old extent of truth. And the second criticism has to do with the old dimensions of truth. I'll explain what I mean by each of those. But all of these, this old idea of truth, postmodernism says, is naive and it's arrogant. So in the first place, modernism failed because of how it held to the old roots and the old extent of truth. Notice here that postmodernism will have to hack so far down to the roots and swing their axe so widely at the extent that their criticism winds up being not only against the modern, but against the classical and the biblical worldviews. Many Christian authors have failed to recognize this. First of all, by the old roots of truth, here's what I mean. The postmodernist swings his critical axe at what is called foundationalism. So you see on the bottom of that picture of a blueprint representing the foundations as in like a house. Foundationalism. What is foundationalism? Well, here's your first problem. Foundationalism was a word that wasn't really widely used until the early 20th century by a bunch of people that really were empiricists, logical positivists, people that believe that nature is all there is. The problem is that foundationalism is saying that there has to be some basic ideas that are foundational to all other ideas. And those ideas have to be certain. You can't get behind them. You can't get around them. And so the criticism against that actually winds up not ever bothering to ask the question, now wait a minute, is this foundation something that's purely in nature, here and now? Or is it something that's eternal? And if you haven't distinguished between that, and you just criticize foundationalism, you're criticizing the whole of Western philosophy and the biblical worldview in the process. So if I can mix metaphors for a moment, the roots of a tree stand for the foundations of a house here. The quest of René Descartes in the 17th century to find some clear and distinct idea behind which he could not doubt only shows us, according to the postmodernist, that every assumption requires still another assumption. And so on backwards ad infinitum. In other words, there's nothing that you can prove to get that process started. There's no such thing as a first principle of deduction, as the earliest philosophers thought there was. With Kant, they assumed, we come to see that all knowledge is presuppositional. All knowledge is circular. All knowledge always assumes other knowledge, and so it's ultimately unjustifiable. There's no one thing that we all must believe of necessity, but each unit of knowledge always assumes countless others. That's what I mean by the old roots of truth. Secondly, by the old extent of truth, the postmodernist swings his critical axe around so widely that there is no idea, no truth, no explanation that is so big that it can be verified by all parties. There's no standard outside of us that binds all of us. No logical laws, no empirical testing. And so to be against this idea of a meta-narrative is to be against something called verificationism. You say, well, I don't care, I'm not a verificationist. Well, here's what they mean by verificationist. A ruler. Anything that makes you think, are there 6 people in this room? Well, that's fine. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Can't do that. That's a verification by a law, by a rule that exists outside of us. Instead, our knowledge is no longer foundational, it's presuppositional. Instead, our standards, our perspectives are no longer verificationist. You can't verify it. They're what's called perspectival. This is an assault on any knowledge about anything whatsoever. So what the Christian needs to see is that these are two things on which historical Christianity and the modern Western view actually initially held in common. This blind striking of the postmodern critique strikes at the heart of Christianity just as much as it does against modernity. But postmodernism also objects to the old dimensions of truth, the things that we mean by truth, the things that make truth truth. When you hear this, you'd be like, who doesn't believe that? Who could possibly attack that and do it with a straight face? Now, for the sake of simplicity, I like to call these the 3 C's. I make them nice and easy, and so the 3 C's are certainty, coherence, and correspondence. Here's what I mean by all of those. And they've all gotten a bad name. By certainty, the classical thinkers, the thinkers from Plato down to Kant, did not mean a subjective kind of certainty. They didn't mean something happening in you. They didn't mean some kind of feeling represented by words like, I am certain about this. But rather, they meant the dimension of necessity in logic. In fact, when they used to use the words self-evident, they weren't talking about yourself, myself, or any number of selves. They meant the thing itself. Remember Kant? The thing in itself. When Thomas Aquinas talked about self-evidence, he wasn't talking about how able you were to get it. He was talking about the thing being invincibly true, such that to try to deny that thing, logically you had to affirm it. By the time you get to the Declaration of Independence and we say, we hold these truths to be self-evident, a lot of water had passed under the bridge, and people started to mean that word self-evident like the rationalists did, something going on in here. Well, what about this idea of coherence? Well, by coherence, I mean the quality of truth, whereby each truth is related to every other truth in exactly the way it is. So there's a lot of reasons why this piece of furniture is in front of me right now. One is that I am behind it. Another is that I'm standing up. Another is that somebody made this. Another is that, and you get the idea, on and on and on and on with an infinity of facts upon which this fact depends. So all truth has to be completely logically consistent with all other truth. Notice I didn't say, in order for you to understand a truth, you have to understand about every other truth. That's a straw man. That's a red herring. What we mean is that every truth is logically, infinitely, completely consistent with every other truth, or nothing is true. That's why you have things like chaos theory today. And then finally, correspondence. What's that? Well, by correspondence, I mean that quality of our thoughts that reflect or picture or represent the real world as it really is outside of our minds, independent of our minds. Now, interestingly, in the 20th century, this correspondence theory of truth actually began to be classified as a theory. But what other kind of truth could there be? How could you mean anything else by truth? This is what knowledge is, as opposed to mere opinion. Knowledge is the truth in the mind. Or to say it another way, truth is the correspondence of mental events with extra-mental events. Truth is objective. It does not depend on our opinions. It does not depend on our feelings. And it does not depend on our various perspectives. And all of this anti-philosophy of postmodernism rejects with a vengeance. They protest. We all have prejudices. We all have tacit understandings, presuppositions, biases that govern our choice of objects. And the Enlightenment blinded us to this. The Enlightenment displayed what they called a prejudice against prejudice. A blind spot against the possibility that we have prejudices. Well, whatever words we use, circular, perspectival, presuppositional, or simply humble, the point remains that there's a clear line from Kant through Schopenhauer to Husserl to Heidegger to the postmodernists. And underneath that line into our world, truth itself has been banished. And as a result, moral behavior, moral judgment has been banished. If any speech from the outside is arrogant and abusive, then any speech from outside of Adolf Hitler is arrogant and abusive. It's actually arrogant and abusive to call Hitler arrogant and abusive if we're consistent, which we're not, because nobody really believes this garbage for a second. They do it to win arguments. They do it to escape moral accountability. They do it to leave their words meaningless so that their actions can remain meaningless. So where is postmodernism going? Coexist. Sorry, I know it's old. I know it's trite to make fun of symbols like that. But how can you not? Will you put a swastika next to a Star of David? Well, that's a good example. Of course it is. And it unravels the rest of this nonsense. Where's postmodernism going? Well, the first and most obvious effect of postmodern thought is how it aids and abets cultural pluralism. One Christian theologian, D.A. Carson, draws a distinction between what he calls empirical pluralism. In other words, I'm just observing a fact. There's many cultures here at a certain time and place. It's a raw fact. Many different ideas, many traditions, thriving on the historic stage at one time and place. And we can agree that's a good thing. But there's what he calls cherished pluralism. When the leveling of the worth of ideas becomes itself the virtue, becomes itself the value. When the purpose of mixing the pot is to stir the pot and to divide and conquer and to make no ideas superior to other ideas so that you can't hold a superior idea over the state and over the abuser. It's intentional. What postmodern thought does to this cultural phenomenon is to translate that sociology, to look out there and see this diffusion of cultures. It translates that into an epistemology of value diffusion. And this is where Hegel is really still very foundational. Two opposing cultural values that momentarily stand in antithesis to each other are absorbed into the synthesis of tomorrow's value. This is not logical philosophy. This is philosophical anarchy. And just as social anarchy involves an arming of the rogue individual so that the new order belongs to those who are armed, so this philosophical anarchy is not a rejection of order. It's a cultural sucker punch. The people that write postmodern books do not believe that their books have no meaning. It's a cultural sucker punch, whether intentionally designed or not, to criticize an older order without admitting that you're doing it, as if order itself were the enemy, only in order to usher in a new order, a new big story, and a new big agenda. What's more difficult to see is the emasculating effect that postmodern thought has on reason's ability to fight even for itself. Think about this. Reason used to be pit positively against faith. When people that didn't believe in truth wanted to see a dichotomy, they saw it between reason and faith, and they chose reason over faith. Now, reason is pit negatively against humility, not only in science departments, but in the church. Reason, authoritative statements, is now pit against humility. Well, more than a century ago now, G.K. Chesterton, in his book Orthodoxy, prophetically observed what was coming. He saw it in his day. Listen to this quote by Chesterton. And listen carefully to the words. This is great. But what we suffer from today is humility in the wrong place. Modesty has been moved from the organ of ambition. Modesty has settled upon the organ of conviction, where it was never meant to be. A man was meant to be doubtful about himself, but undoubting about the truth. This has been exactly reversed. Nowadays, the part of a man that a man does assert is exactly the part he ought not to assert, himself. The part he doubts is exactly the part he ought not to doubt, the divine reason. Back then they used that as a synonym for logic. We are on the road, Chesterton said, to producing a race of men too mentally modest to believe in the multiplication table. And that's exactly where we're at right now. Now, perhaps some more clarifying questions will help. And you'll get a real sense now of what I mean by it being the opiate to the masses. Can you think of anyone? Because when you hear about postmodernism, what do you usually hear? It's in the form of a bold declaration. Modernism back there, postmodernism here. Modernism, knuckle dragging, that was nice. We tried that. I'm all for getting rid of religion. But we all now know, and by the way, every time somebody starts a sentence with, we now know, we usually don't know. And they're doing that to shortcut it. And so you see this as this bold proclamation that we all now know. This is the wave of the future. This is the way everybody thinks. If you don't think like this, you're backward, man. You don't read the French philosophers. What's the matter with you? But if you think hard, can you think of anybody who is still a confident modernist? I can think of a few in the university alone. The math professor, the professors of the hard sciences, the economics professors, and also those of the engineering departments. In other words, those who split the atom, light the prison camps, and inflate the currency are still very much in the tradition of the Enlightenment. They are not postmodernists. They don't read Jean-Paul Sartre. They have no time for that nonsense because they believe the world is there and the world is for them. They're committed to reason as they understand it. And they're committed to objectivity in raw data and practical observations about the world. Now flip the same coin over and ask it the other way around. In what areas of life are those most taken by postmodern thought? Where do they reside? And the answer to that is just as clear. It's those areas that the modern world, notice not the postmodern world, it's those areas that the modern world has deemed the intersubjective spheres, the humanities, philosophy, the creative arts, and religion, so that the spheres that the classical and Christian worldview saw as the most objective, the most determinative to life, are now relegated to the intellectual ghetto of feelings and personal experience. So do you know who tells postmodernism where to go in the darkened corners of feeling? Modernists do. Postmodernism is modernism. Postmodernism is, I don't want to say it that way, that's my friend. That's the way I say it to some of my guy friends sometimes. But postmodernism is just a nice pat on the head. Go run and play with feelings. That's religion, that's still valuable. Poetry, feelings, value, moral, yeah, that's very valuable. You go and study that in the corner there while we get your concentration camp ready. Think back to Saruman again. In the Western tradition, it was precisely the subject matter of the humanities that put people in their place. Humanities, so named because it was the stuff that makes us distinctly human, more than animals. The stuff that stood in between the individual and the state. Think again of the attack on universals. The justice-injustice pair. It represents just one community of meaning. But that was precisely the Nazi argument at Nuremberg. That you're just saying that because that's the meaning of the victors. But in our language game, this was just. This was good. And we were just following orders. It was these universals in the past and nothing else that individual man could hold over the state and move people to resist tyranny. So can you begin to see how the growing global state has quite a stake in promoting postmodern philosophy, particularly to young men whom God has designed with an instinct to fight tyranny, to make them do something else and to think it's clever? Can you see how the emerging global state has a particular stake in postmodernism in the church? In that place where the young man was meant to get his clearest marching orders. As the Apostle Paul wrote to the Corinthians, if the bugle gives forth an uncertain sound, who will get ready for battle? The apostle knew what the modern planners now know. Do you get it yet? Postmodernism is the opiate to the masses. Let me open it up to questions. Oh yeah, sorry.